I want to start with a detail, not a map, not a revelation, just a margin note, the kind you'd scroll past, the kind that, once you've seen it alongside everything else, you cannot unsee. I was going through digitized archives from the 1860s, botanical survey, records from Eastern Europe, looking for something completely unrelated. And I found a note, handwritten in the margin of a forestry report. It referenced trees in the Biała Wieża region producing fruit in unnaturally synchronized cycles, and described root systems that, in the surveyor's own words, appear to communicate purpose. The surveyor, a Polish-born forestry commissioner working under Imperial Russian land surveys in 1863, seemed frightened. The rest of the page was torn away. I filed it away. Then, 6 months later, another note. Different archive, different country, different language, same phrasing, almost word for word. 2 documents, 2 continents, 1 phrase. The deeper I looked, the more I found. And what I found points towards something that keeps appearing at the edges of the record places, and where the trees are older than the story we've been given, where the species shouldn't coexist, where the growth patterns look less like wilderness and more like something that was once, a very long time ago, deliberately arranged for human benefit. Food forests, still arranged, still growing, just not for us, not anymore. And the strangest part, the people who know about these places have gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure you never visit them. If you've been following this series, you'll know that in our last episode we examined the so-called park transformation of the late 19th century. Between roughly 1850 and 1910, across North America, across Europe, across parts of Asia and the Pacific, there was a sweeping and strangely synchronized movement to reclassify certain kinds of land. Forests that had previously been described in local records as providing food, orchards with no known planting history, commons where people gathered produce that nobody planted and nobody owned. These places were, within a remarkably compressed period of time, reclassified, fenced, named nature reserves, declared off limits for conservation purposes. Conservation of what? From whom? The official narrative tells us this was the birth of environmentalism, a noble project, a reaction to industrialization. And maybe that's true, maybe it was only that. But here's the question I kept returning to. Why were so many of these conservation designations applied to the same kinds of places? Places with anomalous tree density, with species diversity that ecologists still struggle to explain, with fruit-bearing and nut-bearing trees arranged in patterns that don't match random forest growth or any known agricultural tradition. And why, in so many cases, were the transitions so abrupt? 1 decade, open access, people eating from the land, local records describing abundance. Next decade, fenced, guarded, reclassified, and the records describing that abundance quietly disappearing from the official archive. Not misplaced, not lost in a fire, disappearing. This raises a simple but critical question. What exactly was being conserved? And from whom? Let's talk about Biała Wieża. It sits on the border between Poland and Belarus. It is the last and largest remnant of the primeval forest that once stretched across the European plain. It is UNESCO listed. It is heavily restricted. Sections of it are completely inaccessible to the public, accessible only to credentialed researchers under strict supervision, and even then, not all of it. There are interior zones within Biała Wieża that have, to my knowledge, never been officially surveyed by any public scientific institution. Think about that. We have mapped Mars, we have detailed topographic surveys of the ocean floor, but there are sections of a European forest, a forest in a modern, politically stable, well-resourced region that remain unsurveyed. The official explanation is preservation. Pristine wilderness should remain pristine. I understand that logic, but here's where the official explanation begins to collapse. Pull up any early Tartaria map, the ones from the 1600s and 1700s that we've been examining throughout this series. the ones published in Amsterdam and Leiden and Paris, the ones with Tartaria Magna or Grand Tartari printed across vast swaths of Eurasia. Draw the western edge of that territorial designation. Follow it carefully. It lands, almost exactly, on Białowieża, not nearby, not in the general region, on it. This is not a fringe observation. Historical geographers have noted the correlation. The Białowieża region appears in multiple pre-18th century sources to sit at or near the western boundary of whatever it was that those mapmakers were calling Tartaria. And those same maps, when you look carefully at the illustrated details within that boundary, the small engravings that cartographers use to fill territory frequently depict trees. Dense, elaborate, stylized trees, not mountains, not cities, trees. What were they marking? The deeper I went into the botanical literature on Białowieża, the more I found that didn't fit. The forest contains species assemblages that have no clear evolutionary pathway. Trees of species that, according to our understanding of post-glacial reforestation, should not coexist in the same ecosystem. The European bison, the juba, which is now the iconic symbol of the forest, was nearly extinct by the 20th century and has been rewilded back into Białowieża. But local oral histories collected in the 19th century described the bison not as a wild animal, but as an animal that lived in managed relationship with the forest, as if the forest and its inhabitants were, together, a system, a managed system. Who managed it? When? And does it still, in some sense, manage itself? Now we leave Europe. We go east. Far east. Yakushima is a small island off the southern coast of Japan. It is famous for one thing above almost all others: its cedar trees, the Yakusugi cedars. Some of them are estimated to be over 1,000 years old, some considerably more. The most famous, Jomansugi, is conservatively estimated at somewhere between 2,170 and 7,200 years old. That range is not a typo. Scientists genuinely cannot agree on the age because the tree's internal structure defies standard dendrochronological analysis. The rings don't behave the way rings are supposed to behave. The official explanation is that the unusually high rainfall and the specific mineral content of the island's granite substrate creates growth conditions that confuse standard dating methodology. That's a reasonable explanation. I want to be honest about that. But here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. The trees on Yakushima are not growing in a random pattern. They are distributed, and multiple independent ecological surveys have noted this in a manner that resembles what permaculture designers call a food forest or forest garden layout. A system designed to maximize canopy diversity, understory productivity, and root network interdependency. The oldest trees sit at the center of zones that radiate outward in decreasing age, as if they were planted, as if they were designed to spread from a point of origin. Planted by whom? Designed by whom? The Jomon period, the archaeological culture from which Jomansugi takes its name, is officially classified as a pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer society, which is, if you press the botanist gently, somewhat difficult to reconcile with a forest system that looks like it was engineered for sustained food production over millennia. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Ancient forest, anomalous tree distribution, official designation as protected wilderness, very limited public access to the old-growth interior, and a dating problem that the scientific establishment has quietly stopped trying to resolve definitively. Not far from Yakushima, geographically and thematically, Aokigahara, the Sea of Trees, spread across the northwestern base of Mount Fuji, covering roughly 35 square kilometers of dense ancient woodland. It is famous in Western media for troubling reasons that I don't want to dwell on here because they're largely sensationalized and they obscure something much more interesting. Aokigahara sits on a bed of ancient lava from a 9th century eruption. This is well documented, and the lava substrate has high iron content, which is commonly cited as the reason for the forest's most scientifically documented anomaly. Compasses don't work properly inside Aokigahara. GPS signals degrade. Electronic equipment behaves unpredictably. The official explanation, the iron in the volcanic rock, is plausible. I accept it as a contributing factor. But the evidence suggests something much larger than a simple electromagnetic quirk. Researchers who have spent extended time in the forest's interior, and I want to be careful here because most accounts are anecdotal, and I am not making definitive claims, describe a persistent spatial disorientation that goes beyond what compass failure would produce. A sense of the forest not being consistent, of paths appearing and disappearing, of the interior being larger than the exterior geometry should permit. This raises a simple but critical question. If a forest can disorient electronic instruments, what else might it be doing? What other kinds of signal interference are we not measuring because we don't yet have instruments calibrated to detect them? And here's the strangest part. Aokigahara was, in pre-modern Japanese sources, described as a place of supernatural significance. Not danger, not death, significance. A place where something important was kept, remembered. The modern framing of the forest has almost completely overwritten that older framing. The older description has been, I don't want to say erased because some of it survives in obscure textual sources, let's say displaced. Buried under newer associations. The silence around what Aokigahara was before modernity rewrote it is, in its own way, deafening. Let me step back for a moment and name what I think is the single most important anomaly in everything we've been looking at. It's not any individual forest. It's not any individual map. It's not any individual botanical mystery. It's the coordination. Within a period of roughly 50 years, call it 1850 to 1900, with notable clustering around the 1870s and 1880s, the following things happened. Białowieża was designated a restricted imperial hunting reserve by the Russian Tsar in 1888, with significant sections made entirely inaccessible to local populations who had used the forest for centuries. At roughly the same time, Yakushima's forests were placed under Meiji-era forestry protection, with logging specifically forbidden in the old-growth interior, though the newer growth was logged aggressively, which is a distinction that has always puzzled historians of the period. Aokigahara, by the late Meiji period, had been so thoroughly reclassified in official discourse that its older identity was essentially invisible in government documentation. Meanwhile, in North America, Yellowstone was designated in 1872, Yosemite in 1890, and in each case, indigenous populations who had actively managed these landscapes for generations were removed. The land was reclassified as pristine wilderness that had been in many cases actively cultivated and managed for thousands of years. Not one designation, not two, dozens on multiple continents, in multiple political systems, empires, republics, constitutional monarchies, all doing the same thing within the same compressed window of time. What coordinated this? What was the mechanism? The official explanation is intellectual diffusion, the idea of conservation spread from person to person, from Thoreau to Muir, from Muir to Roosevelt, from scientific conference to scientific conference. And I don't dismiss that. Ideas do travel, but ideas don't usually produce this level of synchronization across competing political systems on opposite sides of the world. Russia and Meiji Japan were not in close cultural communication in 1888. They were, if anything, rivals. Yet both made near-identical decisions about near-identical kinds of land within years of each other. This is the coordination problem. And the coordination problem doesn't have an official explanation that I find adequate. I want to take you somewhere that might seem like a detour. Bear with me. Bouvet Island, sub-Antarctic, roughly 1,700 kilometers north of Antarctica, the most remote island on Earth. Not one of the most remote, the most. The nearest land is Queen Maud Land, itself uninhabited, itself barely visited, itself largely restricted. There is no indigenous population on Bouvet. There never has been, officially. No economy, no strategic port, no fishing grounds of note, just ice, rock and ocean in every direction for further than the mind comfortably holds. And yet, Norway claimed it in 1928, made it an official territory in 1930, has maintained that claim ever since, quietly, without much public explanation, in the way you maintain something you don't want to discuss but cannot afford to abandon. Why? I mean that genuinely. Why does a modern nation-state expend diplomatic capital to own the most isolated piece of land on the planet? The official reasoning scientific interest preventing rival claims has never fully satisfied the historians who've looked at it closely. Because Norway has never substantially developed Bouvet, never stationed a permanent population, never extracted anything from it. They simply hold it, at considerable logistical expense, in silence. But here's what the official framing consistently omits. Beneath the glacial ice that covers most of Bouvet's surface, and in the coastal margins where the ice retreats, there is vegetation. Ancient vegetation. Moss communities and botanical specimens that researchers who have briefly visited describe as extraordinarily old, extraordinarily undisturbed, growing in patterns that don't match what should be possible at that latitude and in those conditions. Public access is effectively zero. The island has no infrastructure for visitors. Getting there requires a serious icebreaker and considerable institutional backing. The handful of expeditions that have landed are scientific, tightly controlled, and their full findings are not publicly available in any archive I've been able to locate. An island at the bottom of the world. Vegetation that shouldn't be there, claimed by a country that won't fully explain why, off limits to everyone else. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. So, let me bring it back to where we started. The food forests, the managed forests, the forests of the old world that, in the records of the 1800s, were described as providing for local populations without cultivation, without planting, without apparent human intervention. Self-sustaining, abundant, old enough that no living person could remember their origin. What happened to them? Some of them were logged, some were urbanized, some were absorbed into agricultural land. These fates are documented and sad but explicable. But some of them, and this is the thread I've been pulling on for 2 years now, some of them were reclassified. They were declared wilderness, they were fenced, they were given official names and official protections. They were, in a sense, hidden in plain sight. Because what better way to prevent people from understanding what a forest is than to tell them it's something sacred and wild and natural and therefore untouchable? What better way to prevent anyone from studying what the trees are doing, what the root networks are communicating, what the fruit cycles are following, than to make the entire question a matter of conservation law? I am not claiming that every national park is a cover story. I want to be clear about that. Most protected land is exactly what it's said to be. Most of it is conservation in the honest sense. But some of these places, Białowieża most explicitly, but also certain interior zones in Yakushima, certain sections of the Tongass in Alaska, certain high-altitude forests in the Himalayas that don't appear on any publicly accessible survey. Some of these places appear to be something different. They appear to be the remnants of a connected system. A system designed to grow without tending, to feed without farming, to maintain without maintenance. A system so robust that even after what appears to have been a significant civilizational disruption, whatever caused the gap in the historical record that we've been examining throughout this series, even after that disruption the system kept going. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The trees in Białowieża grow in interlocking canopy patterns that maximize light penetration across species. The root networks, when traced by the studies that have been permitted, connect across dozens of hectares in ways that suggest coordination, not competition. The forest doesn't behave like a wilderness. It behaves like a garden, a very old, very patient, very large garden, and nobody is allowed near the centre of it. I've spent a long time on this, longer than any sane person should spend on questions that official history says don't need asking. And here's what I keep returning to. Not who built this, not where they went, not what cataclysm interrupted them, or whether that interruption was natural or deliberate or something we don't have a category for. Those are important questions, but they're not the one that stops me at 3 a.m. The question that stops me is simpler than all of that. Is it still working? The food forests that appear obliquely in 19th century records, the root networks that communicate purpose, the fruit cycles that synchronize across hundreds of acres, the canopy patterns that don't match any model of natural forest succession, the trees in Yakushima that cannot be accurately dated because their rings don't behave, the compass that points wrong in Aokigahara, the forest at the western edge of whatever Tartaria was, sitting behind a fence, largely unsurveyed, in the middle of the most well-documented continent on Earth. Is it still working? Because if it is, if these are genuinely remnant infrastructure from a civilization or a knowledge tradition or a practice that we have no official name for, then they have been working quietly, continuously, for longer than any institution we currently recognize has existed. They survived the disruption, they survived the reclassification, they survived the logging pressure around their edges and the tourism infrastructure at their gates and the diplomatic negotiations over their ownership. They kept growing. And if that's true, even partially true, even in one case, then the question becomes not about the past at all. It becomes about what's been growing all this time, in the places where nobody is allowed to go, tended by nothing, serving no one we know of, following a program we didn't write and don't understand. And whether whoever restricted access to those places did so to protect the forest from us, or to protect us from what the forest might tell us.